Ibn Battuta was trained as a Qadi in North Africa. One day he decided he needed to go for Hajj, and he did. He went for Hajj and stayed on for a number of years. And how did he make his livelihood? Well, he was a Qadi from the Maliki school of fiqh. And so he became a Qadi in the Maliki school. Because in every city across the Islamic world in those days, you had Mahakim Sharia, you had these Sharia courts, and one for each one of the major madhab. So your court in New Delhi, or in those days it was Delhi, your Sharia court in Delhi would have a Hanafi Qadi, it would have a Maliki Qadi, a Shafi'i, a Hanbali, and so on. So when Ibn Battuta decided to leave Mecca and move on to the next place, where did he go? He went to Sri Lanka, Ceylon, Sarandib. He became there a Qadi in the Sharia courts. What about this network of Sharia courts all the way across the world? Because later on he went from Sarandib, he went to Delhi himself. There he crossed the Himalayas and went to China and lived there for years as a Qadi of the Maliki school of fiqh in China. So all across the world you have these Sharia courts. And what they established, what they effectively established was a network through which trade, international trade and business could take place in accordance with Sharia principles. So the example of Ibn Battuta shows us quite clearly what was going on in those days. And a number of studies have been written recently on exactly this phenomenon, how we had how international trade took place, essentially facilitated by means of the Sharia of Islam. Why? Because traders could go from one port to another with their cargoes and with their contracts. And if any dispute arose in any one of those ports, they could find legal redress in the Mahakim Sharia. They could go to to the Qadi and say, "This is my situation," and the trading partner could bring his case, and the matter would be straightened out. So this is how trade was facilitated in terms of transfer of money, in terms of stability. All of that was a part of the Sharia network as well. So by means of the different contracts that we developed over the centuries, we took care of those problems as well. So credit and trade and these things were very much a part of business in those days, and there are a number of academic studies that have to do with that, though certainly not nearly enough, because people, even Muslim business people, are not aware of their history in this respect. So our problem today stems essentially from the fact that we find ourselves operating in a system that is anathema. It's inimical to our own beliefs, to our own system. It does not mesh. It, in fact, represents a danger for us and for everyone else. Nonetheless, it is what it is. We find ourselves in the midst of it. We do what we can as a result to work within it, but in accordance with our own principles. It's not enough anymore for us it's not enough. It's just not our way that we're going to play along with something that represents everything that we understand to be unacceptable. So the opportunity here, is that we now have a global system that presents us with a lot of connectivity, with opportunities for exchange on many, many different levels. And so when Muslims begin putting their heads together on questions of of importance to us, we can discuss these with people all over the place. We can discuss them with our brothers and sisters across the globe. We can bring in the opinions of scholars and experts, whether they're Muslims or not, and we can work together on problems. So shortly after the Second World War, let's call it the colonial era, came pretty much to a close as Muslim country after Muslim country gained its independence. And Muslims across the world began thinking about reviving their society, their Muslim society, and especially the way they went about it was by reviving their institutions. And so we looked at our financial institutions, which had been co-opted by colonialists. We looked at our educational institutions, our legal institutions. We looked at our charitable institutions, our, you name it. The result was that people across the world, Muslims across the world, began talking to one another. And at this time, people became serious about the subject of Islamic finance. In fact, in the early days, people called it Islamic economics. Sayyid Qutb wrote a book. Sayyid Abul A'la al-Maududi wrote a book on the subject. There was an Irani scholar who wrote a book on the subject and of Islami, and people began writing about Islamic social justice, economic justice. As a result, international conferences began to be held, and scholars began thinking seriously about these subjects, but in a theoretical way at first. I mean, the 50s and the 60s were a time of reflection and looking back and attempting to recover something from the past that might be relevant for the future. But in practical terms, we weren't too far along the road until the 70s. At that time, a number of Islamic banks actually opened their doors. People got the idea that, well, we need to have our own financial system. And so, while it was impossible to reinvent the old dinar and the dinar standard, it was possible nonetheless to transact, to contract, and to do business in accordance with Islamic principles. And so a handful of traders, for example, in Dubai got together to establish the first the Dubai Islamic Bank. It opened its doors in 1975 and was followed soon after by several others, Al Baraka Bank, Faisal Islamic Banks, and a handful of others across the world. So that by the 1980s, we had 20 or 30 Islamic banks across the Muslim world. By 1990, we had probably 120 in Islamic banks with maybe 2,000 or 3,000 branches in pretty much every major country of the world. And by 2000, the industry had grown into essentially a multi-billion-dollar industry.